Hello and welcome to Clarkenomics. In this video, we're going to talk about another tool of monetary policy, something called the reserve requirement. All right, so to kick this lesson off, an important thing to talk about is the money supply. I've mentioned it in a couple other videos, but sometimes students get confused about it, and it's very important to understanding what we're going to talk about in this video. The money supply is how much money is available to spend in an economy. The key word here is spend, right? The money in the money supply does not have to all physically exist. And not only that, some money that does physically exist does not count towards the money supply. So the key thing here to remember is how much money is available to spend. So let's take a look at why this is. The way the system works here is we use a system called fractional reserve banking. So let's take this back to what you already know, and then we'll build upon this. When you deposit money in the bank, you take a check to the bank and you put money into your checking account. The bank is going to keep some of that money in what's called reserve. So I want you to think of a safe here, or a vault, whatever you want to do. Reserves, money held in the safes and the vaults and some other places in real life, reserves are not part of the money supply. Why are they not part of the money supply? When they're held in reserve, are they available to spend? No, they're in the vault. So money in reserve does not count towards the money supply. Keep that in mind. Now, of course, the bank's going to keep some of your deposit in reserve, but the rest of it, they're going to lend out to other people. Why does the bank lend part of your money out to other people? Well, they do that so they can charge people interest, right? So they're going to lend out some of your money to others, charge those people interest, and they're going to use some of the interest that they earned to pay you for putting your money in the bank. Of course, remember, they're charging other people more interest than they are paying you. That's called bank spread. That's how banks make money. One of the ways. So, question would be, why does the bank keep any money in reserve at all, right? If they make interest, if they earn interest off lending out your money, why don't they just lend out every single penny that you put into the bank, right? Well, if they did that, what would happen when everybody wanted their money? The bank would have lent it out to other people. There would be none for depositors to withdraw. And banks are required by law to make sure they can cover their depositors. So when you put your money in the bank keeps some of it in reserve. They try to keep just enough to make sure they have enough to give to people who want to withdraw their money. But for the most part, they're lending out as much as they can to other people. Sometimes in history, this has happened. People get freaked out and think their money's not going to be at the bank. So everybody gets panicked and they run to the bank to all withdraw their money. This is what's called a bank run. A couple of good examples would be It's a Wonderful Life and Mary Poppins. This has happened in both of those movies. So in these situations, people freak out. They go to the money all at once to get their money out of their bank accounts, and the bank obviously doesn't have all of it because they've lent it out to other people. In normal circumstances, this does not happen for numerous reasons, which I can't really get into here. But in an emergency situation, the Fed would give a bank a short-term loan to make sure they have enough money for their depositors. Hopefully, everybody then would just chill out, and then the bank can resume normal operations. But another way this happens is because the Fed tells banks they have to keep a certain percentage in reserve. This is what's called a reserve requirement. This is a law set by the Fed. And today, well, not today, but typically speaking, it's 10%. This has changed because of coronavirus recently. So what that means is if you were to put $100 into the bank has to keep $10 of that in reserves. Again, think of the vault, think of the safe, but they can lend out the other $90. Banks also have the option to keep more in reserves if they want to, but they have to keep at least 10% in reserves. So this whole system that I just described, this is called fractional reserve banking because the bank is keeping a fraction in reserve and they're lending the rest out. And it's through this process that money is actually created and destroyed. So let's look at the money creation process based off what we just talked about. So this can get complicated, but I'm going to try to take it piece by piece so that it all makes sense. Let's start off with a woman who has $1,000. Whether it's cash or a check, it doesn't really matter. So she has $1,000 to spend, whether, again, she's holding it in cash, she could spend it. If it's in her checking account, it's available to spend. She can write a check, she can use a debit card, doesn't matter. So we can say that at this point, the money supply is $1,000. That's how much money total is available to spend. So let's imagine she puts it into her checking account and the reserve requirement is 10%. What that means is the bank has to hold on to some of it in reserves. How much? $100. That's 10% of 1,000. But the bank is then free to lend out the remaining $900. So let's say that the bank does this because, again, they want to earn interest. So they're going to lend money out to this guy. Now, this guy has $900 to spend. So what's the total amount of the money supply now? Well, the total amount of the money supply would be $1,900 because she has $1,000 that she can spend, right? It's in her checking account. She can spend that if she wants to. And he just took a loan for $900. So he can spend $900. Does all this money have to physically exist? No. The money supply is just how much money is available to be spent. And since she can spend 1,000 and he can spend 900, the total amount in the money supply at this point is $1,900. So he's going to use that $900 to buy something from this guy's shop. This business owner now has that $900. He's going to put it in his bank. And like all banks, this bank has a 10% reserve requirement set by the Fed, which means of that $900 that he puts in his checking account, the bank is required to hold on to 10% of it, which would be $90. But the other 810 of that 900, the bank is free to lend out. And they do. Let's say that this traveling lady right here takes out a loan for $810. So, where are we at this point? Our first girl, she had $1,000 to spend. This guy has, so this is in her checking account. She has $1,000 to spend. This guy has 900 bucks in his checking account. He's got $900 available to spend. And this girl who just took a loan has $810 that she can spend. So the total money supply now is 1,000 plus 900 plus 810 for a total of 2,710. So that original $1,000 that was part of the money supply is now adding more and more as this money gets put in banks and lent out over and over again. So this girl is going to spend $810 at this lady's shop. This lady's going to put that money into the bank, 10% reserve requirement. The bank has to keep 10% of $810, which is $81, which means that the bank is free to lend out the other $729. Now we've got another guy down here. He's going to get that loan. And you can see what's happening, right? $1,000 to spend, 900 in the checking account to spend, 810 in the checking account to spend. He just took a loan for 729. Add all these numbers together, and at this point the money supply is $3,439. He goes to the store, spends that money. This business owner, like the other ones, puts it in the bank. Bank has to keep 10% of 729, which is $72.90, and the bank can lend out the other $656.10. So this is going to go on for a while, right? Because we can, keep going through the cycle over and over and over again. When will this stop? It'll stop when the amount is too small to take 10% of anymore, right? So that's how the money creation process works. This is how the money supply actually expands. When loans are made, that creates new money. Now, when loans are paid back, because eventually all loans must be paid back, this destroys money because that money is no longer available to spend. But as soon as that money is destroyed and the loan is paid back, somebody else is going to borrow the money and the money supply expands again. So you might be wondering, in just 4 rounds, we turned that original $1,000 into $3,439, right? And you can see each time the amount of the loan gets smaller, right? 900, 810, 729. Again, this is going to keep going down. You might wonder, how long can this go on for if we go through the entire cycle of lending until no more money is left to be lent out? If we go through that, these are the numbers you guys just saw, eventually the money supply from that original $1,000 will become $10,000 if we were to do all the math and go through every single round all the way to the nth day, right? It's too many even to count. So that's how this whole process works. Now, fortunately, you don't have to do all of that math. There's a much easier way to actually figure out how much can the money supply expand by as a result of the reserve requirement. It's something that we call the money multiplier, the simple money multiplier. And it is simple. It's just 1 divided by the reserve requirement. That gives us our money multiplier. So we're going to do an example here with some monetary policy. Let's say that the Fed uses expansionary monetary policy and buys $1,000 worth of bonds from a bank, right? So they're putting $1,000 into the money supply that was not there already. This is brand new money. This is now part of the money supply. It was not before. There is a 10% reserve requirement. Let's figure out our money multiplier. The money multiplier is 1 divided by the reserve requirement. So that is 1 over 0.1. If you do that math, that comes out to 10. So our money multiplier in this situation would be 10. And so if the Fed buys $1,000 worth of bonds, aka adds $1,000 to the money supply, and it goes through this whole lending process, money multiplier is 10. The money supply doesn't expand just by 1,000, the money supply expands by 10,000. Just that $1,000 times the multiplier. Pretty easy, right? So the Fed's initial bond purchase could expand the money supply by as much as $10,000. Now, in real life, it might be less, because let's think about what was happening here. People would get money, they'd put the entirety of that money in the bank, and the bank would then lend out as much as they were allowed to. In real life, those things don't always happen, right? This money multiplier basically tells us the maximum possible monetary expansion. So the conditions that must be true for this to work are banks are lending out as much as they're allowed to. Every single penny that they can legally lend out up to the reserve requirement, they are. In real life, sometimes banks keep excess reserves. They keep more in reserves than they're even required to, just to be safe. So that would decrease the size of the multiplier, right? Or people are holding cash, right? So the money supply can only expand by this much if people are taking all of their money and putting it into the banking system where it can then be lent out. If somebody starts holding on to cash in their wallet or in their house or under their mattress, whatever, that money is not going into the banking system, therefore it cannot be lent out again. So the money supply would not expand by as much. So to reiterate here, if banks are holding on to more in reserve than they have to, or if people are holding on to cash, then the money multiplier doesn't work quite as efficiently, right? So you only get the maximum possible expansion if banks are lending out every penny they legally can and nobody's holding on to any cash at all. Again, unrealistic, things, but this is just looking at theoretically how much could the money supply expand by. So let's do a little bit of practice here. Let's imagine that the Fed buys $1,000 worth of bonds from a bank, just like the previous slide, only this time the reserve requirement is 40%, not 10%, 40%. How much could the money supply expand by, the maximum possible monetary expansion? So first thing you got to do is get your multiplier, right? Your multiplier is 1 divided by the reserve requirement. In other words, 1 divided by 0.4, and that's going to give you 2.5. So the maximum possible monetary expansion is $2,500. So this is like the diagram from the other slide, except you can see that the amounts are much smaller. So when the reserve requirement was 10%, the maximum monetary expansion from $1,000 was 10 grand. When the reserve requirement is 40%, that original 1,000 can only turn into $2,500 of money supply. Why is it so much smaller when the reserve requirement is bigger? Well, the reason for that is, think about every single time, right? Originally, from that previous example, the bank only had to hold on to 10%, only 100, and can lend out 900 in that other one. In this situation, the bank has to hold on to $400, right? 4 times as much, and they can only lend out $600. So in every round, the bank is required to hold on to more in reserves, and it can't lend out as much. And that means the money supply is not going to expand by as much, right? So think about it like this. You might notice a mathematical kind of pattern here. When the reserve requirement is 4 times as high as it was before, right? 40% instead of 10%, the money supply only grows by a quarter as much, right? It was 10,000, now it's only 2,500. So there's a mathematical relationship here too. And again, look at the difference between the two rounds, right? So in the first round with a lower reserve requirement, 10%, you can see the money supply grows by this much, the red box, each time. When it's 40%, these red boxes are much smaller. So the money supply does not grow by nearly as much. And this is where monetary policy, the reserve requirement, can be used as a tool for monetary policy. If the Fed wants more lending to happen, right, they're using expansionary monetary policy, trying to get people to borrow more money, spend more money, expand the economy, they can lower the reserve requirement. Tell banks, hey, you don't have to hang on to as much in reserves. You can lend more out to people. And if the opposite's happening, let's say we're in an expansion and there's like inflation, people are spending too much money, the Fed can say, okay, banks, we're going to require you by law to hold on to more money in reserve. That way, banks aren't lending out as much. And if banks aren't lending out as much, people aren't spending as much, and hopefully that's going to quell inflation a little bit here too. So, as a rule, easy money policy means lowering the reserve requirement. Tight money policy means raising the reserve requirement. Now, for most of American history, the Fed actually leaves the reserve requirement alone. It's much more of a theoretical tool, or at least it was, because there were some pretty large consequences of changing the reserve requirement. It's not like open market operations where you can make little tweaks to the economy as needed. This is like the break glass in case of emergency tool of monetary policy. So again, most of the time in real life, the reserve requirement's about 10%. With all the stuff with coronavirus happening, the Fed actually cut the reserve requirement to zero. In other words, is not requiring banks to hold on to any reserves. Now, again, you might be thinking, well, what if a bank run happens? What are they going to do? The Fed has tools for dealing with this, but right now, to get the economy back on track, to get people spending money to protect people's jobs, the Fed wants people spending as much money as possible. So they're allowing banks to lend out much, much more. And that's actually going to, increase the money supply. That's going to decrease the federal funds rate and make borrowing cheaper as well. So that's a little bit about the reserve requirement and fractional reserve banking. Thank you for watching.